Oh, there's something in my chest that I can't hide. When feelings get involved, I'm terrified. 'Cause I've been here before and said goodbye. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times? For you, I give it one more try. Turn away and wrestle with my doubts. Oh, I leave them all behind, but don't know how. Bury my head deep within the crowd, but I'm reaching for your hand to pull me out. Oh, are you the one when I try to look, I wish I'd find? Oh, how can I love when I've been hurt 100 times?
All right, let's get going here, shall we? All right, I was just trying to figure out my stopping point for the night. The chapter is about 43 pages, too much for one night for me. So let's see, we're starting on 537, so we'll stop at around about 57, between 57 and 60. All right, that'll work. As long as I've got that in my mind. Okay, get the cheaters on. So, final chapter, chapter 3 of part 3, Glimpses. All physicists understand that when you are dealing with unobservable phenomena, such as what goes on inside an atom, the first necessity is to formulate a theory that fits the available known facts. Without a theory, facts are merely baffling pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, lying disconnected in the box. In the present chapter, I shall try to suggest a general theory that might impose some order on the bewildering mass of occult phenomena already examined. The essence of this theory can be stated in a few sentences. For various reasons, ordinary consciousness is hopelessly subnormal and inefficient. There's something wrong with it, rather as if a whole batch of cars were sent out of a factory with some tiny but essential component missing. Various religious, ascetic, and mystical disciplines have attempted a cure for this deficiency, which Christians call original sin, but the greatest stride forward was taken in the final years of the 19th century when Edmund Husserl began to work out the discipline called phenomenology, a form of analytical psychology based upon the recognition of the intentionality of all our mental acts. This discipline, which even now is only partly understood, is slowly leading to an understanding of the precise mechanisms involved and therefore of the part that is missing. The basic position of this book is that if the machine could be made to work normally, man would acquire or learn to use various powers and faculties that at present are occult, latent or hidden, and would discover that they are perfectly natural after all. All occultism has recognized the existence of a vital force that has never been identified by orthodox science. Mesmer called it animal magnetism, and Mary Baker Eddy believed that it was the secret of health. In 1845, there appeared in Germany a bulky work whose lengthy title can be abbreviated Physico-Psychological Researches on the Dynamics of Magnetism, etc., in relation to the vital force. It was by a respected chemist and physicist, Baron Karl von Reichenbach, and it caused a sensation. It was the kind of book that today would become an immediate bestseller. He stated on an early page, quote, and this is a lengthy quote, "Through the kindness of a surgeon practicing in Vienna, I was introduced in March 1844 to one of his patients, the daughter of the tax collector Novotny, number 471 Landstrasse, a young woman of 25 years of age, who had suffered for 8 years from increasing pains in the head, and from these fallen into cataleptic attacks. In her, all the exalted intensity of the senses had appeared, so that she could not bear sun or candlelight. I allowed the father of the girl to make the first preparatory experiment. I directed him to hold before the patient, in the middle of the night, the largest existing magnet, a 9-fold horseshoe, capable of supporting about 90 pounds of iron. This was done, and the following morning I was informed that the girl had really perceived a distinct continuous luminosity as long as the magnet was kept open. The fiery appearance was about equal in size at each pole. Close upon the steel from which it streamed, it appeared to form a fiery vapor, and this was surrounded by a kind of glory of rays." End quote. He found 4 more neurasthenic girls, and they all saw the same light. Some of them saw it as a kind of aurora borealis radiating at a brilliant reddish-yellow light from the south pole and the bluish-green from the north. Suggestion hardly seemed to account for it. For example, he made an assistant go into the next room and uncover a huge magnet directly behind the girl's bed. She became uncomfortable and declared there was a magnet around somewhere. He tried blindfolding her. She knew when the magnet was uncovered, i.e., when the armature was no longer joining its 2 poles. When Miss Novotny was out cold in a cataleptic condition and a horseshoe magnet was brought near her hand, the hand stuck to it as if the flesh had been a piece of metal. But as Miss Novotny's health improved, no doubt because of all the attention she was getting, she lost her ability to see the aurora around magnets. Reichenbach was no crank. When he heard that certain sick sensitives had been able to magnetize needles by holding them, he carefully tested this and found it to be untrue. He tried magnetizing other substances. Crystals were an obvious choice. These affected his patients in the same way. He then tried the effect of unmagnetized crystals, and to his surprise, these also worked. He bought a huge crystal and drew it gently down the patient's arm. She felt a pleasant sensation like a cool breeze. Drawn upward, it produced a warmth that was not entirely pleasant. He tried it on a fellow experimental science, and to his surprise, this completely healthy man unmistakably felt the action of the crystal. The obvious inference was that magnets and crystals both conduct electromagnetic force, but this quickly proved incorrect. So what was the force they both seemed to possess? Reichenbach decided to call it odic force, or odil, odyle, O-D-Y-L-E. And as he went on to try more and more substances, zinc, sulfur, alum, salt, copper, he found that all seemed to have some degree of odic force, although the colors were often quite distinctive. His experiments with the odic force of precious and semi-precious stones seemed to confirm the occult and alchemical tradition about their nature, although this aspect did not interest Reichenbach in the least, for there was nothing of the occultist about him. Human beings possess odic force in an unusual degree. He discovered it can be seen as a kind of light streaming from the finger ends, and not only by sick sensitives, quote unquote. Reichenbach discovered that about a third of all people seem to be more or less sensitive to the odic force. By the time his book appeared in English in 1851, the activities of the Fox sisters and the youthful Daniel Douglas Hume were exciting the world. It seemed perfectly natural to attribute the activities of the spirits, or whatever they were, to odic force. The more skeptical were inclined to believe that it was the medium's own odic force that made the tables move. As to how the odic force could be transmitted across rooms or even across oceans, the spiritualists were inclined to accept the suggestion that there is some kind of psychic ether that carries the waves, a hypothesis that has been revived in our own time by Professor C.D. Broad. Experimenters in other countries tried Reichenbach's experiments and obtained the same results. For example, Dr. John Ashburner, the English translator of Reichenbach, packs the book with his lengthy notes on his own experiments, sometimes agreeing and sometimes disagreeing with Reichenbach. It is not surprising that all this Germanic thoroughness impressed everybody. But even from the beginning, there were critics who declared that Reichenbach's book was a tissue of absurdities and fallacies. And in England, James Braid, the man who investigated hypnotism, found a simpler explanation for the odic phenomena, hypnotic suggestion. That, he said, was why the patients had to be sick and sensitive. The people who had hailed Reichenbach's book as the most important contribution to science since Newton's Principia began to mute their enthusiasm and express misgivings. And in 1859, the great Darwin controversy swept across the world, and odic force was looked back upon as a passing fad and its discoverer as a misguided crank. Any scientist whose work could be quoted by spiritualists must be a crank. And yet, although Reichenbach's researches in magnetism has been long forgotten, and the few libraries who possess a copy usually classify it under electricity, it remains an unforgettable and convincing book. Could it be that he was right after all? The Hindus believe in a force called Kundalini, which the yogis attempt to control. It ascends the spine and moves from center to center in the body. Temple paintings in India, Ceylon, and Japan often show auras emanating from the body, and the color schemes are strangely reminiscent of Reichenbach. Paracelsus states, quote, "The vital force is not enclosed in man, but radiates round him like a luminous sphere. In these semi-natural rays, the imagination of man may produce healthy or morbid effects." End quote. Excuse me. In Man's Latent Dreams, 1938, Phoebe Payne describes the psychic aura of living things. Quote, "I remember well that as a tiny child my absorbing interest in flowers was due not only to their beauty but to the curiosity of watching their wheels go round, in the form of their different emanations, some of which showed as a fuzz of luminous mist, while others radiated in a shower of minute sparks or prickles, and I soon learned to associate a nice smell with a flower from which there rose a column of silvery smoke. In the same way, my delight in playing with any kind of animal was partly caused by the fun of experimenting with different effects produced by tickling or clutching at the responsive something with which it was surrounded. Throughout my early years, I was unaware that not everyone experienced such contacts. End quote. That this sensitivity is the odic force is fundamentally of the same nature as the powers of psychics like Herkos or Quaset is clear from the remark, quote, as time went on, adaptation to my personal environment only became more difficult, an uncompromising affair in which I suffered defeat most of the time, chiefly because the behavior of the ordinary world differed so much from the slow tranquility on the one hand, or the swift creations constantly blossoming into beauty on the other, of what was to me the more real side of life. Adding to this was the constant misery of being acutely aware of people's thoughts, and still more of their emotions, as something objective which they themselves usually did not seem to recognize. End quote. In the year 1939, an eminent Freudian psychologist, Wilhelm Reich, startled and enraged his colleagues by announcing that he had discovered a new form of energy unknown to physics, the vital energy which regulates the health of living creatures. The case of Wilhelm Reich is so strange that it is worth considering at some length. It recalls Reichenbach in many ways. Reich was born in 1897, and by the mid-1920s, he occupied an influential position in the psychoanalytic movement in Vienna. He was a member of the Communist Party until expelled in 1933 for expressing the view that fascism is the outcome of sexual repression rather than economic forces. One of the most interesting concepts was that of character armor, the tortoise-like shell which neurotics create to cover up inner weakness and anxiety, and which may even express itself in the form of muscular rigidity or paralysis. Reich saw the psychiatrist's task as the breaking down of this armor. But clearly, there is something negative about this concept. Anyone's character can be interpreted as defensive armor, whether he is extrovert or introvert, destructive or creative. And if one becomes too obsessed by Reich's notion, one is likely to end by seeing everybody as sick. There we go. Reich had a Reich had a concept of a healthy personality, someone who has learned to express sexual impulses with complete freedom, but he was perceptive enough to see that this was also negative. It is in fact merely a restatement of D.H. Lawrence's position. The orgasm cannot really be the ultimate goal of the human race. His mind groped for some more positive concept, and in 1939, in Norway, he believed he had found it, orgone energy. Quote, orgone is a visible, measurable, and applicable energy of a cosmic nature, end quote, says Reich in a footnote to Character Analysis, page 304. Quote, modern natural philosophy, in order to explain the world, has been obliged to recognize an imponderable universal agent and has even proved its presence. On this main principle of cosmogony, Zoroaster is in agreement with Heraclitus, Pythagoras, with St. Paul, and Kabbalists with Paracelsus. Sibyl Maya reigns everywhere, the mighty soul of the world, the vibrating and plastic substance which the breath of the creative spirit uses at will. The fluid becomes transformed, it rarefies or densifies according to the souls it clothes or the world it envelops. End quote. Sibyl Maya. I am not familiar with that term, or person, or deity, or whatever. I'll have to look that up. This is not a quotation from Reich, but from Edward Scher's Great Initiates, and he is speaking about the astral light. Reich rediscovered the astral light and called it orgone energy. This is a blue energy which permeates the whole universe and which forms a field round living beings. Reichenbach's Odile, Phoebe Payne's aura. The reason that the physical contact between child and mother relieves anxiety, for example, is that their orgone fields unite like two drops of water. In the sexual orgasm, orgone energy becomes concentrated in the genitals. It is the tingling feeling experienced in sexual excitement. Living matter is made up of bions, which are tiny cells pulsating with orgone energy. How did Reich come to make this astonishing discovery? It is important to understand that he saw it as a strictly logical development of his Freudian psychology. Neurosis is caused by sexual stasis, stagnating sexual fluid, quote unquote, and the orgasm discharges the sex energies and eliminates the neurosis. Reich found himself inclined to believe in some specific biological energy distinct from physical energies. The biologist Kammerer had postulated a similar energy. It is Shaw's life force, but this biological energy is physical, not somehow spiritual. Sometime around 1933, Reich believed that he had detected the basic unit of living matter, the bion, under the microscope. If living matter is made to swell up with potassium hydroxide, for example, these bions become clearly visible. If particles of carbon are dropped into the filtered solution of bouillon and potassium chloride, says Reich, the blue bions soon begin to appear, and the heavy carbon particles change their nature and become living matter. When bions degenerate, the result is what Reich calls T bacilli, which cause cancer. It was after years of performing experiments to create bions, which Reich claims are quite clearly visible under the microscope, that he stumbled on orgone energy. He had been examining a sea sand culture under the microscope daily, and his eye developed conjunctivitis. He concluded that this sea sand culture gave off some powerful form of radiation. Tests for radioactivity were negative. Yet he discovered that the sea sand culture could cause flesh to become swollen and painful. People in a room with many such cultures became headachy and tired. He observed that in the dark, the cultures seemed to give off a gray-blue light. Objects could become charged with this blue energy and would then influence an electroscope. He finally concluded that this new unknown energy comes from the sun and that organic substances have the power to absorb this energy and retain it. He constructed a box to prevent the energy escaping. It had to have metal walls because organic matter absorbs orgone energy, and layers of organic matter outside which would absorb any energy that managed to get through the metal. He observed bluish light around the dishes of the culture in this box, and then, to his amazement, he observed the same blue light in the box when the cultures had been removed. On a holiday in Maine in 1940, Reich observed that stars on the eastern horizon seemed to twinkle more than those on the western horizon. He reasoned that if twinkling is due to the diffusion of light in the atmosphere, it should be the same everywhere. When he observed that there seemed to be blue patches between the stars that flickered and gave off flashes of light, then the answer came to him. Orgone energy permeates everything, and it causes the flickering of the stars. His box had been picking up this energy in its outer organic layer and sending the energy in through the metal walls where it became trapped, like heat in a greenhouse. This was the origin of Reich's orgone box, which one of his disciples has described as the greatest discovery ever made in medical science. The orgone box is an energy accumulator, says Reich, and if sick people sit inside one, they can quickly be recharged. If they sit too long, the result is headache and a feeling of sickness like getting sunstroke. Excuse me. Reich was totally convinced of the importance of his discovery, but his fellow scientists and doctors would not have it at any price. They said that his photographs of bions were simply bacteria that had got in from the air. Reich said that if you stare at the blue sky, you see waves passing rhythmically across it. The scientists said that the waves were simply the fatigue of the eye muscles. As to Reich's belief that the twinkling of stars, the blueness of the sky, the rippling waves above a hot road, the darkness of a thundercloud, are all due to orgone energy. They simply pointed out that there are less fanciful explanations for each of these phenomena. Excuse me. The last year of Reich's life was tragic. He was convinced of the vital importance of his discoveries, and his foundation in Maine set out to make them known. He made many converts, but the medical profession reacted as it has reacted to all innovators since Paracelsus. In 1956, Reich was sent to prison for 2 years and fined £10,000, having been accused by the Food and Drug Administration of selling harmful quack remedies. He died of a heart attack after 8 months in prison. Only careful and unprejudiced examination of his claims by scientists can decide whether Reich was totally deluded during the last 25 years of his life, or whether he had really stumbled on an important discovery. All that can be said at the moment is that there is still no sign that any scientist is prepared to make such an examination. His claims have been dismissed out of hand. It will be seen that these claims by no means conflict with the theories advanced in this book. For example, with Dr. David Foster's notion that cosmic rays may carry information codes. According to Reich, cosmic rays are fundamentally orgone energy, and nothing is more likely than that they possess inherent organizing powers over matter. Reich points out that we feel emotional energies to be of a different nature from electrical energies, and again, he is obviously right. In fact, if we may state the minimum working hypothesis that has emerged in the course of this book, it is this, that there are energies concerned with vital processes that have not yet been identified in the laboratory. Reich argues that cancers develop in organs of the body that have, quote, played a dominant role in the muscular armor that repressed sexual excitation, end quote. There is still a tendency among research workers to consider cancer a virus disease, but it is equally certain that it bears a curious relation to a drop in vitality. For example, American research revealed that students who had succumbed to severe nervous depression as a result of overwork showed an unusually high incidence of cancer. The view of Bernard Shaw expressed in Back to Methuselah is closer to Reich's. Shaw believes that the universe is permeated with life energy and that some matter is a good conductor and some is a bad conductor. If I sustain a bad bruise, the conductivity of the flesh may be damaged so that it conducts a lower life current, which may enable it to develop on its own as a separate entity. Reich would say that the bruised flesh shows a degeneration in its biome structure. And this raises another interesting question. Most bruises do not turn into cancers. What is the law involved here? The process seems to bear some resemblance to the process involved in mental illness. That is, a person sinks into a condition of vague defeat and depression, but it makes no real difference to his everyday activities, and his mental states vary from day to day. Then one day, some unpleasant event or momentary fear plunges him to a lower level, and he stays there, as if he had fallen down a steep step or over a cliff. And a tremendous long-term effort is needed to raise him back to his old level. It is as if human evolution is not an uphill slope, but something like a steep flight of steps. As Shaw points out in the Methuselah preface, evolution does not progress steadily, but by sudden leaps. If you are learning to ride a bicycle, you fall off 50 times and then find yourself suddenly riding in the 51st time. As if each time you tried to ride it, you accumulated a little more skill, which did not show immediately, but went into a reserve supply until you were ready to go up the next step on the stairway. The significance of this must be discussed later in the chapter, but one point can be made immediately. If we can tumble down the evolutionary stairway through boredom and defeat proneness, we can also clamber up to new levels by a gentle, cumulative effort. No frenzied leap is required, and evidence indicates unmistakably that these higher levels are the levels upon which man's latent powers cease to be latent. Reich's comments about sexual excitement raise a point of vital importance in this discussion. Sexual excitement occurs in two parts: a mental part where the imagination is important, and a physical part where the body takes over and explodes into physical climax. We take this for granted, but it is almost unique in the realm of human experience. If I am moved by a piece of music or by the smells of a spring morning, my imaginative excitement increases, then it recedes, without any physical counterpart. This imaginative part is intentional. That is, a sudden noise can break my concentration and ruin the whole thing. The teenager who experiences an orgasm for the first time recognizes the astonishing nature of the occurrence. It is almost as strange as if he sprouted wings and flew. What had before been largely an intentional mental excitation has burst into the realm of the physical, and this in itself seems amazing. For after all, the body catches colds, gets hungry, feels fatigue, without asking my mind's permission. Human beings suffer from this mistaken notion that the body and mind run on parallel tracks, without really influencing one another. But most people who experience early sexual development do not, because they are intensely preoccupied with the subject, and this preoccupation adds up, like efforts to ride a bicycle, until one day the leap occurs, in this case the power of experiencing a physical climax. Which raises the interesting question, what other powers could we develop if we made a determined effort? Consider a curious case cited by C.D. Broad from the Occult Review from 1929. A Mr. Oliver Fox describes how he developed a capacity for, apparently, leaving his body. In 1902, Fox had a dream, during the course of which it struck him suddenly that he must be dreaming. He went on dreaming, but the knowledge that this was only a dream produced a feeling of great clarity, and the scenery of the dream became unusually vivid and beautiful. He tried to develop this knack of self-awareness in dreams. It happened infrequently, but when it did, he always experienced the same feeling of clarity and beauty. He also discovered that once he was in control of the dream, he could float through brick walls, levitate, and so on. What was happening was, in fact, the reverse of a nightmare, where your legs refused to run. He gradually became fairly expert at inducing these dreams, but observed that if he tried to prolong them, he experienced a pain in his head. He assumed this to be in the pineal gland, the unused eye in the center of the brain, which occult tradition declares to be the doorway to other states of being. If he ignored the pain and continued the dream, the result was a feeling of bilocation, as if he had left his body and was floating above it although still aware of his body. Eventually, he discovered that if he tried determinedly, he could overcome the pain. When this happened, there was a kind of click in his head which he identified with the opening of the pineal door, and he then felt himself to be wholly located in the scenery of his dream, which, as before, would appear far more beautiful than normal. These dreams were followed by a return to his body and another dream to the effect that he was back in bed and waking up. Broad points out that another observer, the Dutch physicist von Eden, also had false awakening dreams like lucid dreams, similar to Fox's. Fox then attempted to induce these states while awake, lying on a bed and putting himself into a trance. He could feel his body becoming numb, and the room would seem to take on a golden color. He had then to use his imagination and picture himself hurtling towards the pineal doorway. If he was successful, he felt himself passing out of his body, and the golden color increased. He would experience, in a sense, a great clarity and beauty just as in his dreams. Sometimes he was unsuccessful and would then experience a depressing sense of his astral body fading and the golden color dying away. Once he had passed the pineal doorway, he would be able to float over scenery which was sometimes familiar, sometimes not, and see people at their ordinary occupations, although they did not seem to see him. Sometimes they seemed to sense his presence and were frightened. Ooh, man. Sorry. Van Eden, yeah, maybe, also cited in Broad's lectures in psychical research, actually held, Van Eden, also cited in Broad's lectures in psychical research, actually held conversations during his lucid dreams with people he knew to be dead and had a strong sense of their reality, although they seemed to be deliberately hesitant and vague in answering his questions about life after death. I'm going to stand up for a minute here. I start getting droopy for some reason. Not breathing enough, I guess. These stories immediately bring to mind A. Swedenborg's conversations with the dead, and B. John Cowper Poy's apparition to Theodore Dreiser. Raynor C. Johnson remarks in Nurslings of Immortality, quote, "It is not, I think, generally known that apparitions have been created deliberately and experimentally. The well-attested cases of this are not numerous, but there are a number of records which show that the concentrated efforts of the will to appear to another person have led to the latter perceiving an apparition. End quote. Page 101. I have already cited the case from Tyrrell's apparitions, in which a woman appeared to friends in Kew by an effort of will. It is also observable that she passed into a kind of trance, similar to Fox's, in which her body slowly became numb. In Man's Latent Powers, Phoebe Payne describes man's etheric body as follows, quote, "This body of subtle physical material acts as the vehicle for the circulation of human vitality and is an infinitely delicate bridge between the psychic worlds and the physical brain consciousness. It is the special qualities of this body which constitute the main difference between the psychic and the non-psychic person. The etheric counterpart interprets the whole of the physical anatomy corresponding to it cell for cell, and also extends beyond it to a distance of 4 to 6 inches according to the nature of the health of the individual. This outlying portion is called the health aura and is visible to ordinary sight under favorable conditions of lighting. Many people can catch a glimpse of it in a half light by bringing the fingertips of the two hands near together and slowly drawing them apart, when a nebulous emanation can be sensed or seen flowing from one hand to the other. This duplicate subtle body appears often as a fine filmy mesh completely surrounding the ordinary physical body, mainly gray in color. To trained clairvoyant sight, it is an intricate structure of delicate hues. End quote. The mention of fingertips perhaps leads one to suspect that the etheric body and odic force are somehow connected, and another paragraph suggests that the etheric body functions on orgone energy. Oh, on orgone energy. Okay, odic force, orgone energy. Okay. Quote, in addition to being the bridge that connects man's subjective experience with the brain and nervous system, the etheric body has the very important function of transmitting vitality from the surrounding atmosphere into the dense physical vehicle and of eliminating used etheric matter. End quote. Eisenbud treats the etheric body as a serious hypothesis in his book on Ted Sirios, for the images that Sirios imprinted on the photographic plate could not always be explained as photographs he had seen and memorized. Two exceptionally clear shots of Russian Vostok space rockets, apparently in space, could not be traced at all in the literature on the subject, and a shot of Westminster Abbey was taken from an angle that would require an actual cameraman to hover well off the ground. Sirios began, of course, as a traveling clairvoyant, and in the absence of more down-to-earth explanations, Eisenbud is willing to consider the hypothesis that this is how Sirios obtained some of the images he fixed on the Polaroid plate. He goes on to make the interesting assertion that about 25% of people have experienced out-of-body experiences, in which the body seems to be seen from a higher point in space. While researching this present chapter, I mentioned the subject to a neighbor, Mrs. K. Lunas, who described a similar experience that occurred when she was seriously ill. At the crisis point of the illness, she had the sensation of seeing her body recede away below and then gradually come closer until she re-entered it. Eisenbud says, quote, a significant aspect of these experiences is the unanimity of agreement among those who report them, a unanimity all the more striking in that the great majority of the subjects have never heard of the phenomena before having experienced it, as to the complete qualitative differences between the experience of being out of the body and states of dreaming or reverie. End quote. He goes on to cite at length an experience sent to the SPR by an armored car officer who was blown up by a German anti-tank gun in 1944 and hurled through the air covered with burning phosphorus. Quote, the next experience was definitely unusual. I was conscious of being two persons, one lying on the ground in a field, my clothes, etc., on fire, and waving my limbs about wildly, at the same time uttering moans and gibbering with fear. I was quite conscious of both making these sounds and at the same time hearing them as though coming from another person. The other me was floating up in the air about 20 feet from the ground, from which position I could see not only my other self on the ground, but also the hedge and the road and the car, which was surrounded by smoke and burning fiercely. I remember quite distinctly telling myself, it's no use gibbering like that, roll over and over to put the flames out. This my ground body eventually did, rolling over into a ditch under the hedge where there was a slight amount of water. The flames went out, and at this stage I suddenly became one person again. End quote. A parallel example of traveling clairvoyance is cited by Sir Oliver Lodge in his article on psychic science in The Outline of Science. It is from Sir Alexander Ogston's book, Reminiscences of 3 campaigns. He describes feeling separated from his body during an attack of typhoid. Quote, "In my wanderings there was a strange consciousness that I could see through the walls of the building, though I was aware they were there and that everything was transparent to my senses. I saw plainly, for instance, a poor RAMC surgeon of whose existence I had not known, and who was in quite another part of the hospital, grow very ill and scream and die. I saw them cover his corpse and carry him softly out on shoeless feet, quietly and surreptitiously, lest we should know that he had died, and the next night I thought, take him away to the cemetery. Afterwards, when I told these happenings to the sisters, they informed me that this had happened just as I had fancied." End quote. A case cited by Thurston Hopkins raises a further speculation. A Miss Helen Brooks describes her experiences of astral projection, which she calls exteriorization, in dreams. Hovering over some sleeping children, she observed a misty, quote, misty vapor emanating from the tops of their heads, or peering closer, I was able to see what they were doing astrally, for reflected in the vapor were the activities of their astral bodies. End quote. Miss Brooks speculates that ordinary dreaming is actually the activity of the astral body, a view also held by many primitive people who believe that a person must be waked cautiously to allow the spirit to return to the body. Miss Brooks's account brings to mind Ouspensky's description of seeing sleeping people with their dreams hovering around their faces. He also commented that it was almost possible to read their minds. Now, all this is conceivable. We may or may not feel disposed to accept it, but it does not in any way conflict with our knowledge of the workings of the world. In the same way, if Dante could have looked into the 20th century, he would have thought radio and television very strange, but their existence would not have contradicted everything he already knew about the universe. There is no scientific evidence for or against the astral body, although there is plenty of evidence for traveling clairvoyance, which seems to point to it. Okay, let's sit back down here. Moving all over the place tonight. Restless. On the other hand, experience of precognition does contradict what we know or think we know about time. By time, we mean process, something happening. If you could imagine a completely empty universe with nothing whatever in it, it would also have no time. Time is something that is measured by things happening to physical entities. By a spring unwinding inside a clock, by my body slowly becoming older, as far as we know, it is irreversible. If I am listening to a record and I want to hear something over again, I can put the stylus back onto earlier grooves, but there is no time machine to carry me back to yesterday, and the very idea is an absurdity. Because if I could go back to yesterday or even 10 seconds ago, I would meet another me 10 seconds younger. I could, in theory, collect millions of duplicates of myself and bring them all back to the present. No, the trouble lies in our use of language and ideas. I have elsewhere used the following illustration. Suppose people were born on moving trains and stayed on them all their lives. They might invent a word to express the sensation of objects flowing past the windows of the train, a word like zyme, for example. And if the train stopped, they would say that zyme had been arrested. And if the train reversed, they might say that zyme is going backwards. But if someone wrote a book about traveling backwards or forwards in zyme, it would obviously be the result of sloppy thinking. Zyme does not exist in itself. It is made up of several things: landscape, a train, and myself observing the flow of the landscape past the window. The same goes for time. It does not exist. Only a process exists. In that case, how the devil can I possibly dream of the future? Common sense tells me that anything can happen. Imagine a swarm of bees humming around above a flower garden. No calculating machine in the world could predict the position of a particular bee 20 seconds from now because it depends upon the movements of thousands of other bees, all flying at random. If precognition is possible, it would indicate that this view is false. But even the dotiest occultist would hesitate to assert that there is no such thing as chance. Gurdjieff asserted that most people's lives are all chance. But consider the following experience of J.B. Priestley's mentioned in his Man and Time. Quote, another fairly lengthy one here. Quote, "The dream belongs to the middle 1920s. I found myself sitting in the front row of a balcony or gallery in some colossal vague theater that I never took in properly. On what I assumed to be the stage, equally vast and without any definite proscenium arch, was a brilliantly colored and fantastic spectacle, quite motionless, quite unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was an unusually impressive dream which haunted me for weeks afterwards. Then in the early 1930s, I paid my first visit to the Grand Canyon, arriving in the early morning when there was a thick mist and nothing to be seen. I sat for some time close to the railing on the south rim, in front of the hotel there, waiting for the mist to thin out and lift. Suddenly it did, and then I saw, as if I were sitting in the front row of a balcony, that brilliantly colored and fantastic spectacle, quite motionless, that I had seen in my dream theater. My recognition of it was immediate and complete. My dream of years before had shown me a preview of my first sight of the Grand Canyon." End quote. Priestley mentions that he became fascinated with the Grand Canyon and later visited it many times. It was this intense interest, he believes, that made him dream about the Grand Canyon in advance. He cites a similar case of intuition of the future that makes the same point. It involves two people he knows well. A doctor noticed that he experienced a curious excitement on receiving duplicated official reports that came from the department head by a Mrs. B. This excitement intensified as he received more of them, although they were in no way personal reports. A year later, he met her, fell in love with her, and married her. Mrs. B experienced no similar excitement with regard to the doctor. On the contrary, she did not particularly like him on first acquaintance. For the most part, the cases quoted by Priestley, and there are hundreds, all involve a happening of some importance. A mother dreams that she has left her 1-year-old child by a stream while she goes to get soap to wash clothes. When she returns, he is face down in the water and dead. Later in the summer, on a camping holiday, she suddenly recognizes the scenery when she is, in fact, about to leave the child alone on the edge of the water as she goes to get the soap. Sensibly, she picks up the child and takes him with her, so there is no way of knowing whether the dream was truly premonitory, but the chances are in its favor. She cites other cases. Wait a minute. Okay, yeah. She cites other cases less dramatic, but perhaps more important. A woman who had had a strong intuition of some impending disaster, so that she began to cry during the service at St. Martin in the Fields, realized it was connected with her 19-year-old son as soon as she saw him on returning home. 3 weeks later, he became ill and died. What happened during his illness is equally curious. He told his mother, quote, "A dog is going to bark from a long way off," end quote. A few seconds later, the dog began to bark. He said, quote, "Something is going to be dropped in the kitchen and the middle door will slam," end quote. Seconds later, an ant dropped something in the kitchen and the door slammed. The illness had apparently caused his brain to work just ahead of time. Priestley also cites a case in which Sir Stephen King Hall had a sudden, clear premonition that a man would fall overboard in a moment. He decided to act on the hunch and gave orders about mustering the boat crew. As the Commodore was asking him what the devil he thought he was doing, there was a cry of "Man overboard" from a ship behind them in the convoy, and then, immediately after, from another ship. Their boat was in the water within seconds, and both men were pulled aboard. Here it may have been the fact that it was a double emergency that somehow triggered the intuition. Inevitably, Priestley devotes a great deal of space to the time theories of J.W. Dunn, theories that caused a great deal of excitement in the 1930s and inspired three of Mr. Priestley's own plays. In An Experiment with Time, Dunn describes how he was puzzled by the accuracy of some of his dreams. He dreamed his watch had stopped at 4:30, and when he looked at it, the watch had stopped at 4:30. The next morning, checking with a clock, he realized it had stopped only minutes before he woke up and found it had stopped. In a posthumous book, Intrusions, he mentions that a great crowd was yelling, "Look, look," at him as the dream ended. A subsequent attempt to see the time by closing his eyes and dozing was equally successful. Later, he dreamed of a volcanic eruption and then saw it in a newspaper that there had been such an eruption in Martinique. The newspaper account mentioned that 40,000 people might be killed. In his dream, Dunn had been convinced that 4,000 had been killed. But the newspaper later proved to be quite wrong about the number. It was this that led Dunn to assume that what he had dreamed about was not the eruption itself, but seeing the newspaper headline with its mistaken figure. He had obviously misread 40,000 as 4,000. He then began to experiment, keeping a pencil and paper by his bedside and writing down unusual dreams on waking. The result convinced him that he often dreamed of things that would happen in the future. Dunn was an intelligent man, an aeronautical engineer with an amateur interest in physics and mathematics, so he tried to construct a theory that would fit in with Einstein's relativistic notion of time. The result convinced many people at the time, but has steadily lost ground since then. Roughly, what he says is this: if time is something that flows or marches on, then there must be another kind of time by which we measure its speed, so to speak. And there must surely be yet another kind of time by which we measure the speed of this time too. This time too. TWO. However, this puzzling assertion is not really important to his central thesis, which is that human beings also have several levels. There is the me who lives and suffers my life. There is another me who is conscious of this first me, and which becomes apparent when I speak of myself. End quote. Probably, Dunn says, there are also an infinite series of me's. It is this second detached me who exists in time number 2 and who is able to look backward and forward in time. Okay, I'm going to have to sit up here again. To explain this strange assertion, Dunn makes another assumption. Suppose everything that happens to me during my life is laid out in a series of pictures like a Technicolor film, starting with my birth and ending with my death. If I go through life dully and passively, like a cow, I would have a singularly monotonous quality. It would have. In fact, I pay attention to some things and ignore others. So there is one me that drifts through life merely seeing, and another me who directs attention at something I see and not at others. Dunn calls this second observer mind. Normally, mind has a narrow choice of what to look at, the events of my life. But when I am asleep, it no longer has anything to focus on, and then, says Dunn, it may occupy its time glancing at the past or future. He decides finally that there is a universal mind of which individual minds are small aspects. At this point, we may leave him, for he has obviously taken the leap into a kind of mysticism that has no relevance to the present discussion. Okay. Priestley takes Dunn as his starting point and has some penetrating suggestions. He rejects Dunn's notion about an infinite number of selves, pointing out that all we need is three. There is the me who merely observes blankly, the me that exists as I stare out of the window of a train, half asleep, merely recording passing scenery. If I pull myself together and begin to reflect on what I'm seeing, if, for example, I am passing through scenery that interests me and I stare with great intensity, looking for something, then a second me comes into existence, the me who judges and discriminates. And then there is a third me who often observes the other two. For if I am able to observe the second me, there must be a third me to do so. Priestley gives a good example of the three me's. On an aeroplane journey, Self 1 observed unpleasant sounds in the aircraft and felt himself hurled out of his seat. Self 2, jerked into existence by the accident, observed that something was wrong, i.e., judged the situation instead of observing it passively. Self 3 thought coolly that he would shortly know what it was like to be fried alive. As to time itself, Priestley suggests that there seems to be three varieties. There is the ordinary time that passes as I go about my ordinary tasks. There is the time I become aware of in moments of stillness and contemplation, for example, what Arnold Toynbee experienced in the moments when he became aware of all history. And there is a kind of time that I seem to be able to control in moments of great intensity. The time I experience when I'm intensely creative, of the second kind, he writes. Sorry, I know that's getting rough. Of the second kind, he writes, quote, I remember coming to a halt outside a fine large fish shop. As I stared at the scales and the fins and the round eyes, looking indignant even in death, I lost myself and all sense of passing time in a vision of fishiness itself, of all the shores and seas of the world, of the mysterious depth and wonder of oceanic life. This vision was not in any way related to myself. My ego was lost in it. And real poets, I suppose, must be kept enjoying such selfless and timeless visions. They came to me only rarely. It might be from the sight of something like those fishes gleaming on the marble, or after I had heard somebody merely say France or Italy, or from simply reading the words 18th century. But they brought me at once a feeling of immense variety, richness, and wonder of life on this earth. End quote. All right, we have a few more pages to get to the 20-page mark, and then I need to start looking for a good ending spot. Oh, man. As to time 3, he goes on to speak of the tremendous speed and with which he wrote 4 of his most successful and difficult plays, and comments that looking back on the experience, quote, I felt like a man watching himself run at a headlong pace across a minefield, end quote. He is inclined to believe that the unconscious mind has its own kind of time, and that this is what is involved in this kind of headlong creativity. What Priestley now suggests is close to the time theories expressed by Ouspensky in A New Model of the Universe, and Ouspensky's follower J.G. Bennett in The Dramatic Universe, that time has 3 dimensions like space. He cites the case of the wife of General Tuchkov, who dreamed 3 times that her husband had been killed at a place called Borodino. They looked up Borodino on a map but could not find it. It is only a tiny village. But Napoleon invaded Russia. The Battle of Borodino took place, and she was informed of her husband's death under the precise circumstances of her dream. This certainly suggests that time is predetermined, like a gramophone record. But what of the case of the mother who decided not to leave her child by the stream? Priestley cites several similar cases in which a warning in a dream enabled someone to avoid disaster. This suggests a second kind of time connected in some way with the power. Quote, connected in some way with the power to connect or disconnect potential and actual, end quote. And apparently that's from Bennett. Priestley's theory, then, is that time 1 is the ordinary passing time of everyday living, quote-unquote living and partly living, as Eliot says. Time 2 is contemplative time, which sometimes becomes apparent to us in dreams. Time 3 is the time in which changes can be made. Blake seems to have been describing this when he wrote, quote, each man is in his scepter's power until the arrival of that hour, when his humanity awake and cast his own scepter into the lake. End quote. We might say, following Gurdjieff, that man is usually in a sleeping state. In moments of contemplation, such as Toynbee experienced near Mistra, he wakes up, or Faculty X wakes up. But a further awakening is still possible, in which he lives and acts with real freedom, in which he can really do things. Priestley's final view is that we are faced with a future, quote, already shaped but still pliable, end quote, and that even when the body dies, we somehow continue to exist in times 2 and 3. Ouspensky is inclined to accept Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, the notion that we live our lives over and over again, but he also believes that slight changes are possible, that some people have an inner ascending line, quote unquote, that slowly raises them to a higher level. He distinguishes 2 other types, those for whom success becomes increasingly easy, and those who have an inbuilt degenerative principle that causes them to sink from life to life. That this view of Ouspensky's was no casual speculation is proved by his novel The Strange Life of Ivan Osokin, in which the hero, disappointed in love, asks the magician to allow him to go back in time so he can avoid making the same mistakes. But as in Barrie's Dear Brutus, he repeats the same mistakes all over again and comes back to the same point, the meeting with the magician. But this time he realizes what has happened and asks the magician if things cannot be somehow altered. The magician, obviously Gurdjieff, smiles and says, quote, that is the question you should have asked earlier, end quote. In other words, things can be changed if man can learn to be. He must cultivate the tiny grain of freedom he possesses. Okay, we're on 555. We're finishing 555. So about 5-ish pages left. Ouspensky's vision may seem unnecessarily gloomy, and if, in fact, we really possess some of the powers suggested in this chapter, then it is almost certainly untrue. He suggests that a man is chained to his body, and his destiny like a galley slave. But if that is so, how is traveling clairvoyance possible? Moreover, Priestley describes a number of dreams in which the dreamer appears to have dreamed someone else's life. Excuse me. For example, he himself had an extraordinarily convincing dream in which he seemed to be some kind of spy in a foreign city who was shot by security police as he tried to steal some naval secret. Priestley says he thinks the balance of probability is that he somehow relived the last moments of a real man. The poet Ronald Duncan is in reply to my question as to whether he had had any occult experiences, sent me a story entitled Flame of the Forest, in which he had fictionally embodied his own experience of having lived before. He comments, quote, "As a child I found that I was worried by images which would flash into my mind without any apparent cause. For example, when I was going to tie my shoelace on the way to school, I would, as I bent down, always visualize a street scene in a city where I had never been. I became interested in race memory as a possible explanation, for I constantly had the experience of remembering something which I had not myself experienced." End quote. The story is told by a Hindu. Duncan spent many years in India as a disciple of Gandhi, who declares that he was born in England as Abercrombie Martin, and tells how he had been completely dominated by his father, who seemed to want to relive his own life vicariously through his son. Experiences of a certain ford on a certain river kept flashing into his mind, particularly when he bent down to pick things up. He went to India and wandered around as a kind of tramp. One day he found himself by the ford at the river in a kind of daydream. Suddenly a woman spoke to him, his wife, and he was no longer an Englishman named Abercrombie Martin, but a Hindu named Jitendra Narayan, who had gone to fetch water in a jar and fallen into a daydream by the river. Duncan is here trying to catch the essence of certain moments when one's feeling of certainty and identity dissolves, revealing not a world of confusion or insanity, but strangely logical vistas. In the preface to this epic poem, Man, he describes how, sitting in his London flat, he was possessed for several days by memories that belonged to the past of the human race, a sense of déjà vu, not simply about himself, but about his remote ancestors. He explains that he had daubed the bare walls with color to relieve the monotony. Glancing up, excuse me, Glancing up from his writing later, he realized that he had, without realizing it, drawn a bison, a matchstick, men, and prehistoric animals. This happened before he saw similar drawings produced from the caves of Lascaux. Duncan also experienced a sense of smell so acute as to be intolerable. This is quote, "a sense of smell so acute as to be intolerable. While it lasted, I found I could smell every odor